This alien planet is sponsored by Campfire Technology, who've just launched the open beta for their brand new software Blaze, which, by the way, is completely free for the whole of October. For more information, check out the link in the description or stick around until the end of the video. In the last episode, we explored how the aquatic ecosystems have developed since life first moved onto land, as well as how some of the terrestrial clades secondarily adapted for life in the water. This transition was partly prompted by the same climate change event that transformed the interior of the supercontinent from lush forests into open steppe. But even after the atmosphere reaches equilibrium, the climate won't remain stable for long. For the past few tens of millions of years, the east and west halves of the supercontinent have been steadily pulling away from each other, forming a rift valley along the divergent boundary at the center of the supercontinent, and pushing up mountain ranges along the coasts. As these mountains grow taller, they'll form an increasingly impassable barrier against the oceanic weather systems, blocking the rains from reaching the inland regions and creating a sizable rain shadow. The areas far from the coasts may experience a continued decline in rainfall, becoming the first deserts. Areas within the tropics will remain hot and barren year-round, while areas further from the equator will become cold deserts and tundra. And within the temperate latitudes, areas between these deserts and the coasts will experience seasonal rainfall, swinging between extremes of dry and wet. All of these biomes share low levels of precipitation, extreme temperatures, and, consequently, low biodiversity. However, even habitats as inhospitable as these present new niches free from competition, which will incentivize some species to specialize for life in the harsh conditions. Much like how the intertidal zone acts as a medium for organisms emerging from the water, the seasonal areas act as a medium for species transitioning to life in the deserts, as everything that lives in these habitats will need to adapt for prolonged periods without water. In particular, the plants in these regions face a unique challenge. Under most conditions, the chemophytes will benefit from a large surface area to let them gather as much sunlight, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide as possible. However, a larger surface area will also lose water faster through transpiration, or evaporation through the stomata covering the leaves. As such, the trees in these areas may evolve smaller, narrower leaves to minimize transpiration, and thicker, more bulbous trunks to store extra water, for which we'll give them the name nodophytes. Although the nodophytes may outcompete the other xylophytes in dry or seasonal habitats, many of these areas may still not experience enough rainfall to support any substantial forests. The dominant ground vegetation will still mainly consist of brachyphytes, which don't require nearly as much water as the xylophytes thanks to their small size, but they may still evolve a mechanism to help them weather periods of drought. Having large leaves only presents a risk of excess water loss during the dry season, so these brachyphytes may evolve a way to reduce their surface area as the seasons change. Abscission occurs when an organism intentionally sheds a part of its anatomy that's no longer necessary or beneficial to maintain. For example, deciduous plants have evolved to shed their leaves in response to the onset of winter, an adaptation that reduces their overall surface area to prevent water loss. The seasonal brachyphytes may opt for a similar solution. At the end of the wet season, they may shed their leaves, abscising all parts of the plant that emerge above ground level. The bulbs will remain dormant underground throughout the dry season, regrowing their leaves once the rains return. Because of this, the seasonal steppe may appear more or less the same as the tropical steppe during the wet season, but once the dry season arrives and the brachyphytes shed their leaves, they'll leave the landscape denuded of vegetation. These brachyphytes, which we'll call cryptophytes, will thrive in areas with any degree of seasonal variation. This seasonal dormancy may be mimicked by some animals as well. Although somewhat overshadowed by the larger osteopods, the lophostomes will also have representatives in the open habitats. The ubiquitous malacoforms are small and adaptable enough to survive on very little food and water, and wherever there are malacoforms, there'll be desmostricans to feed on them. Meanwhile, some of the plecostricans may switch from a diet of mixed forest vegetation to feeding solely on brachyphytes, evolving grasping tentacles to pluck their leaves from the ground, strengthened forelimbs to help unearth buried bulbs, and a rasping, muscular mouth to chew through the tough, drought-resistant plant tissues. These adaptations will help these plecostricans to thrive in habitats where brachyphytes constitute the dominant vegetation, but those species living in seasonal areas may evolve one further adaptation to help them endure periods of intense drought. Numerous unrelated clades on Earth have evolved various forms of dormancy to help avoid harsh conditions. Dormancy specifically in response to hot, dry conditions is called aestivation, and may evolve among the Plecostricans as a means of getting through the worst of the dry season. Shortly after the cryptophytes lose their leaves and food becomes less plentiful, they may bury themselves in mud and enter a state of decreased metabolic activity, remaining underground for as long as 3 or 4 months until the rains return. Let's call this clade the Xerostricans. But the easiest way to survive the dry season is to simply leave in search of more accommodating habitats. Although herbivores like the titanopods and leptopods may inhabit these areas during the wet season, the parched landscape may not offer them enough food or water during the dry season, so they'll migrate to more bountiful feeding areas near the coasts, and as the herbivores move away, their predators, like the onocodonts, will likely follow suit. But one of the most mobile clades of animals are the Opisthophterans, whose flight allows them to travel further than any of the ground-dwelling clades, facilitating a migratory lifestyle. Flying animals face many of the same constraints that swimming animals do. They need to maintain stability around roll, pitch, and yaw while striking a balance of speed and maneuverability. The key difference between flying and swimming is the density of the surrounding medium. Atmospheric density can vary considerably from planet to planet, but our alien planet's atmosphere is more or less comparable to Earth's, meaning the air is roughly 800 times less dense than water, and therefore it doesn't provide anywhere near the same level of buoyancy. So unlike swimming animals, flying animals need to exert a lot of downward force in order to stay airborne. For an animal to be able to fly, the amount of lift it generates needs to equal or exceed the strength of gravity pulling it down. The most efficient way to generate lift is to increase velocity, but flying faster requires extra energy to maintain. An easier option is to increase the wing's surface area, which can be done by evolving a larger body size. However, yet again, the square-cube law comes into play, since doubling the wing's size in all dimensions will quadruple its surface area, but will simultaneously octuple its volume and therefore its weight, and so it will need proportionally larger wings to keep it aloft. But efficient flying depends not only on the wing's size, but also on their shape. Generally, pointed wings provide more speed, whereas rounded wings give more maneuverability. Unlike flying animals on Earth though, Opisthophterans also have a pair of forewings, or canards, formed from a membrane between the first 2 pairs of limbs. These canards don't flap up and down to contribute to thrust, but are simply held out to increase the size of the effective wing surface and are constantly adjusted to alter flight performance, somewhat similar in function to the tail feathers of birds. Depending on their size, shape, and position, canards can provide increased stability, lift, or control. Like their elastospondyle ancestors, the first Opisthophterans will be small, forest-dwelling predators, meaning they'll need to be adept at darting among the tree branches of the dense canopy. As such, they may evolve short, broad wings to provide a high degree of maneuverability. Their canards may be relatively large, forming up to 1/3 of the flight surface and occurring just anterior to the wings, which will improve their ability to execute sharp turns. We'll call this early radiation of Opisthophterans the Latopterans. But as they diversify, another clade may adapt to more open habitats like the steppe, where they'll no longer need their ancestors' maneuverability. These species may therefore attain larger sizes and evolve more pointed wings to give them increased speed, and narrow canards to assist in takeoff and landing and in diving for prey. Most species in this clade will be steppe-dwelling pursuit hunters, using their great speed to chase down small prey scurrying amongst the brachyphytes. We'll call them sphenopterans. However, as the continental interior dries out, species living within the seasonal zones may evolve migratory behaviours to help escape the dry season, and so may instead invest in adaptations for travelling long distances. This can be done by evolving long, narrow wings with a high aspect ratio, and by positioning the canards further forward to provide extra lift. Although their lack of a well-developed support structure prevents them from growing too large, this clade will include some of the biggest of all Opisthophterans species, and thus we'll call them Magnopterans. But while their long wings and efficient gliding may help many species migrate to new feeding areas, these same adaptations will also allow species living in desolate habitats to scour large areas in search of scarce food, and so a few Magnopteran species may remain within the arid regions all year round, possibly even colonizing the desert at the center of the supercontinent. This desert will be one of the harshest environments on the planet, experiencing negligible precipitation and dangerously high temperatures throughout the year. There won't be nearly enough water to sustain any xylophytes, and without the relief of seasonal rainfall, even the cryptophytes will have difficulty surviving. The only plants likely to thrive in the desert are those few brachyphytes that can adapt to cope with perpetual drought. Like the nodophytes, these plants may evolve enlarged fleshy tubers to store water and shorter, thicker leaves with tough cuticles to minimize water loss through transpiration. However, this will also reduce the amount of sunlight, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide the plant will be able to take in, decreasing the efficiency of photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. In the extreme heat of the desert, this may be a tricky balance to strike, but some plants may find a way around this constraint. The only reprieve from the oppressive heat comes with nightfall, when the temperature plummets by as much as 30 degrees. In the cooler temperatures, the risk of excessive transpiration decreases dramatically, making for an ideal time for the plants to open their stomata and take in carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. However, there's obviously no sunlight at night, so they can't carry out photosynthesis, but some plants may evolve to store the carbon dioxide within their leaves to use when photosynthesis resumes once the sun rises. Relying on this mechanism, they can afford to keep their stomata completely closed during the day, keeping as much water as possible trapped within their leaves. This alternation between opening and closing the stomata with the day-night cycle has evolved many times among desert plants on Earth as well, and is one of the most efficient ways of conserving water in especially arid climates. These adaptations will help these brachyphytes, which we'll call tylophytes, to survive the extreme heat, but another difficulty of life in the desert presents itself when it comes to reproduction. Since chemophytes are capable of reproducing asexually, a single plant can quickly establish a colony around a habitable area. But when carrying out sexual reproduction, they'll need to spread their gametes across the desert to other colonies. The majority of chemophytes carry out sexual reproduction by simply releasing their male gametes into the air, letting the wind carry them far from the parent plant. With any luck, at least a small number of them may land within the female gametangium of another plant and fertilization can take place. This works well enough at high population densities and in more hospitable climates, since the higher the concentration of plants in a given area, the higher the chance of the gametes landing on a gametangium. But in the desert, the asexual colonies may be separated by enormous distances, which may be impossible to bridge just by relying on favourable wind conditions. One of the only ways to improve the reliability of this system would be to produce enormous quantities of gametes to give more chances for fertilization to occur, but this would be extremely inefficient and a huge waste of precious resources. To overcome this, the tylophytes will need another, much more targeted mechanism of dispersal, which may come in the form of other organisms. Many plants on Earth employ animals to carry out pollination and seed dispersal for them. There are many forms this can take, which we'll examine more thoroughly later, but just about every variation relies on the plant finding a way of attracting a pollinator. For the tylophytes, this will be fairly easy, since these plants and the oases they grow around will serve as some of the only concentrated sources of food and water the desert has to offer. When an animal comes to feed, drink, or simply rest, it will inadvertently get the plant's gametes stuck all over itself. To facilitate this, the tylophytes may evolve gametes covered in tiny hooks or needles to more effectively cling to their host's body. The animal will then carry the gametes with them as they travel across the desert, unwittingly spreading them to other colonies they visit. This dispersal strategy is far more efficient than relying on the wind, and will help the tylophytes become the dominant desert flora, but even these plants won't occur frequently enough to support very many herbivores. The hazardous conditions preclude most clades of animals from colonizing the desert, but those few that do tend to converge on several common traits. Firstly, desert-dwelling animals tend to be quite small, not only because of the lack of food, but also because of, you guessed it, the square cube law. The larger the animal becomes, the more body heat it will generate, and the less surface area it will have to radiate the excess heat away. This specific application of the square cube law is sometimes referred to as Bergmann's rule, and suggests that animals living in hot climates will tend towards smaller body sizes than those living in cold climates. Because of this, megafauna like the titanopods may not fare well in the desert, as their huge size will cause them to overheat very quickly and demand far more food than the desert can provide. On the other hand, the leptopods, being much smaller, will be far less susceptible to heat stress, and so may be one of the few herbivorous clades to have desert-dwelling representatives. In addition to becoming smaller, another way of increasing surface area seen in many animals living in hot climates is to evolve specialized dermal structures like dewlaps, wattles, or enlarged ears. The desert leptopods may likewise turn the loose skin on the underside of their cephalothorax into a sort of membranous crest riddled with blood vessels to maximize their rate of heat exchange. Since food sources are so widely scattered, desert animals also benefit from specializations for covering long distances. To this end, many of the leptopod's cursorial adaptations provide an advantage. Their long stride length not only gives them speed, but will also help them very efficiently travel many miles every day in search of food. The desert-dwelling species may strengthen this advantage by evolving longer, more widely spaced legs, and their pointed, hoof-like feet may widen to stop them from sinking into the sand. When swept up by the wind, the sand can also damage the more vulnerable parts of an animal's body, particularly the eyes, so many desert animals will also have some way of keeping their eyes protected. At this point in their evolution, most osteopods have quite simple eyes, consisting of a tube-shaped chamber containing a single lens. Unlike vertebrates, osteopods can't turn their eyes within their sockets, instead having each of the 6 eyes fixed at a different angle to grant a wide visual field. They also have no eyelids, only a glassy, waterproof outer surface, which will be at risk of getting obscured or scratched by the sand, so to keep them protected, the desert leptopods may evolve specialized muscles to retract the eyes deeper into their sockets, and extra skin around the eye's circumference to close over them and conceal them. Many species may also evolve a fringe of elongated setae around the eyes for further protection. Finally, desert herbivores also need to conserve as much water as possible, with some common adaptations including well-developed kidneys and the ability to reabsorb water through the lining of the gut, which minimizes the amount of water wasted when the animal excretes. In some desert animals, like the addax and the kangaroo rat, these mechanisms are so efficient that the animal can survive solely on the water it gets from food, never once needing to drink. These same adaptations may occur in the desert leptopods as well, with the renal glands at the base of their limbs enlarging to filter the blood more efficiently and to produce more concentrated liquid waste. All of these adaptations will make these leptopods, which we'll dub amblypods, some of the most specialized inhabitants of the desert. And despite the numerous challenges involved, living in the desert does come with some advantages. Because prey populations are so small, there'll be very few predators to worry about. Instead of expending precious resources to actively hunt prey, it's much more efficient for a desert carnivore to simply scavenge for prey brought down by heat stress or dehydration. Many desert-dwelling species of magnopterans may adopt this lifestyle, flying far and wide over the landscape in search of carcasses. But another clade poised to take up the niche of desert scavengers are the eurychirids, who already have well-developed scent organs to detect food over long distances, and are generalist enough to make use of every available food source. Like the amblypods, the desert eurychirids may evolve smaller body sizes to increase their surface area, and efficient excretory systems to conserve water, but they may also undergo some behavioral adaptations to cope with the harsh climate. As mentioned earlier, the desert temperatures drop sharply at night, making it a much safer time for animals to go about their lives. As such, most desert animals are either nocturnal, only becoming active during the cool of the night, or crepuscular, only active during dusk or dawn. Both strategies help to avoid the fierce heat of midday, but also mean that these animals will need to adapt to low-light conditions. The easiest way for an animal to increase the acuity of its night vision is to evolve larger eyes, letting them take in more light. Specifically for an animal with more than one pair of eyes, like the osteopods, the most efficient arrangement is to have a single disproportionately large pair of eyes, while the other pairs remain comparatively small. The enlarged pair of eyes may also undergo further specializations for night vision, such as evolving a tapetum lucidum, a reflective membrane lining the eye that passes light back through the retina to increase the rate of absorption, a common adaptation in many nocturnal animals on Earth. But increasing the size of these eyes will also make them more vulnerable to damage from the sand, so like the amblypods, these eukaryotes may evolve a ring of muscle that can close over the eyes to protect them. Subtly adjusting this muscle will also allow them to precisely control the amount of light that enters the eye, much like an iris, letting them adjust their vision to the changing light conditions throughout the night. While the anterior-most eyes do most of the work of taking in light and resolving a clear image, the other two pairs of eyes may still serve to increase depth perception and give them a wider field of vision, but otherwise remain fairly small and unspecialized. However, if these eukaryotes adapt for nocturnality, they'll need to find a way to sit out the heat of the day, and the open landscape doesn't offer much in the way of shelter. One of the most common solutions among desert animals is fossoriality, or adaptations for digging, which allows nocturnal animals to remain in the safety and shade of their burrows during the day. Fossorial animals tend to share a number of key adaptations in common. Firstly, and most obviously, powerful front limbs specialized for digging through the substrate. Fortunately, the eukaryotes already have broad forelegs, used by the steppe-dwelling species to unearth buried eggs. In the desert species, these limbs may become stouter and more heavily muscled, with enlarged claws to rip through and clear away as much sand and soil as possible. Fossorial animals also tend to have small, fusiform bodies and short limbs to help them squeeze through their tight burrows, and any external structures, like ears or tails, tend to be reduced or absent to avoid unnecessary friction. As such, these eukaryotes' walking limbs may become smaller, and their pedipalps, adapted for sensing and processing food, may shrink so as to not get in the way of the digging claws. Thanks to these adaptations, they'll be able to tunnel underground to escape the sweltering heat, only emerging from their burrows at night to find food. Their generalist diets will let them exploit virtually any food source they come across, including carcasses, tylophyte tubers, and whatever small prey they can find. But these eukaryotes will be put under their greatest stress when it comes time for reproduction. Like all osteopods, the eukaryotes produce oothecae, which contain the developing young as well as a yolk, or source of nutrients that the embryos depend on to complete their development, only hatching once the yolk is exhausted. However, because resources are so scarce in the desert, it will be difficult to provide enough nutrients to last for the young's entire development period. With a smaller yolk, the young may hatch out prematurely, lacking functioning eyes or even solidified bones. In such an underdeveloped state, they'll be very vulnerable, especially in such an inhospitable habitat. To boost her offspring's chances of survival, the mother may lay her ootheca beneath a carcass or some other source of food to provide the young with enough nutrients upon hatching to last the rest of their development. However, this imposes a time pressure on the young to hatch before the carcass desiccates, so these eukaryotes may be selected to minimize the length of time they spend developing within the ootheca, which may eventually culminate in another instance of ovoviviparity. In the previous episode, we discussed how ovoviviparity evolved in the seagoing thalattotheres as a way of circumventing the need to come ashore to breed. For these eukaryotes, ovoviviparity will let their young start feeding from the moment they're born while the carcass still offers fresh meat, a strategy that has convergently evolved among many clades of carrion-eating flies on Earth. Ovoviviparity is sometimes used as a general term for any form of reproduction that falls between oviparity, or egg-laying, and viviparity, or live birth. A more accurate term to describe the form of reproduction seen in the thalattotheres and these eukaryotes is licithotrophic viviparity, which specifies that the young still rely on the yolk while inside the mother. These eukaryotes will be equipped to make the most out of every resource available in the barren landscape. Let's call them lystrochyrids. Meanwhile, moving northward from the center of the supercontinent, levels of precipitation remain low, but temperatures become steadily colder. The planet still has a higher average temperature than Earth, but the northernmost edges of the supercontinent will be just short of the Arctic Circle, and will thus be fringed with areas of cold deserts and seasonal tundra, experiencing short, cool summers and long, bitterly cold winters. In these biomes, the drought-resistant nodophytes may have an advantage over other xylophytes, and so may be the primary constituents of the few forests that grow here. The cryptophytes may form the dominant ground vegetation, since they can undergo abscission to avoid the freezing winters. However, even during the summer, it will still be fairly cold and dry, so they'll benefit from a smaller surface area to reduce transpiration. We'll call this family of cryptophytes pagophytes. The animals in these habitats will experience the opposite trends to those found in the desert. a larger size and decreased surface area will let them conserve more body heat. In this regard, the titanopods have a head start, since their enormous bodies will generate enough heat to keep them at a fairly constant high temperature. This mechanism of staying warm through size alone is called gigantothermy, and will help the titanopods counteract the effects of the cold despite their lack of true thermoregulation. There may not be enough trees in the tundra to support the high-browsing proceropods, but the baropods may be able to survive on the pagophytes and other low vegetation, and so some species may expand their range northward. And wherever there are populations of large herbivores, the predatory onocodonts won't be far away, and so they too may reach the colder latitudes. The onocodonts aren't quite as large as the baropods, so their bodies can't store as much heat, but their endothermy will more than compensate for this. What once evolved as a means of maintaining high levels of activity can now be repurposed to let them colonize variable or inhospitable climates. In contrast to species living in hot climates, animals living in cold climates tend to have rounded, stocky bodies, short limbs, small ears, and a general lack of any structures that unnecessarily increase their surface area. Likewise, the tundra-dwelling osteopods may become larger and more heavy-set than their southern relatives, with shorter legs and smaller pedipalps. These two clades will serve as the dominant megafauna in the tundra and constitute some of the largest land animals on the planet. We'll call them pachypods and hadrodonts. But despite their adaptations to the cold, most species in these clades may still only inhabit the tundra during the relatively mild summers, as even their gigantothermy may not be enough to help the pachypods endure the coldest parts of the winter, and so they'll be forced to migrate to warmer areas to the south, and the hadrodonts will likely follow their prey populations as they migrate, leaving the seasonal tundra largely devoid of megafauna during the winter. But in some areas, such as the high-altitude regions within the northwestern mountain range, temperatures will remain uncomfortably low all year round, and may therefore be too inhospitable for the pachypods and hadrodonts. Those few clades that do manage to colonize these areas will need a more specialized defense against the cold. Like the onocodonts, the leptopods are endotherms, which gives them an edge in cold climates, so they too may form part of the tundra ecosystems. Once again, in accordance with Bergmann's rule, these forms may grow to larger sizes than their steppe and desert-dwelling sister clades, but they may gain further protection from the cold by increasing the efficiency of their thermoregulation. One relatively easy way to do this is to stop the body heat they generate from dissipating, in other words, to evolve a layer of insulation. Many animals do this with layers of fat or blubber, which also acts as an energy reserve when food is scarce. But since air itself is a very efficient insulator, one of the most effective ways to stay warm is to trap a layer of air close to the body. This is most commonly accomplished with some sort of specialized integument or body covering, whether it's fur in mammals, feathers in dinosaurs, pycnofibers in pterosaurs, or any one of the dozens of different dermal structures found among invertebrates. In the case of our leptopods, the sarcopods from which the terrestrial osteopods descend were covered in setae, embedded within mechanoreceptors to sense vibrations in the surrounding water. However, in a low-density medium like air, vibrations become much harder to detect, and so in most land-dwelling species, the vestigial setae have reduced to a tiny, almost microscopic scale, except in areas like the spiracles, where they serve to keep the airway clear of debris, and around the base of the pedipalps, where they form the hearing mechanism in most species. But while they may have lost their role in mechanoreception, they'll serve as ideal structures to adapt into a coat of insulation, and so these tundra-dwelling leptopods may re-evolve a covering of elongated setae, which, in addition to their subcutaneous layers of fat and rotund bodies, will make these leptopods superbly adapted to the cold. However, just like with the lystrachirids in the desert, these animals will be at their most vulnerable during their embryonic development. In the tundra, if the mother leptopod simply buries the ootheca and abandons it, like most osteopods do, the young may die from the cold before they even hatch. For their offspring to have any real chances of survival, these leptopods will need to evolve a basic measure of parental investment. All osteopods have a pair of gonopods, which assist in the transfer of gametes during mating and help the females deliver the ootheca. But in this clade, they may also be used to cradle the ootheca once it's been delivered, keeping it close to the warmth of the mother's body. The female's gonopods may become larger to more completely envelop the ootheca and to keep it as warm as possible as the mother wanders the tundra. The mother will only abandon her young once they hatch, at which point they'll be developed enough to survive on their own. Along with their shaggy coats and bulky bodies, this form of reproduction will help these leptopods colonize areas too cold for other herbivores like the pachypods, and with the resulting absence of competition, they'll be free to expand into the as-of-yet unclaimed megafaunal niches, attaining even larger sizes and becoming one of the most successful clades in the tundra. We'll call them thylacopods. But not all species in the tundra will respond to the cold by getting bigger. Although it's called Bergmann's rule, it's more of a general trend than an actual rule. While a larger body size does let the animal retain a greater amount of heat, it also demands more food to maintain, and so areas of the tundra where resources are especially limited may see clades tending towards smaller body sizes, like how the Arctic tyrannosaur Nanoxaurus was only about half the size of its infamous cousin T-Rex. Similarly, the hadrodonts may be limited in their distribution to those areas with large enough populations of prey, while elsewhere the predatory niches may be better exploited by some of their smaller relatives who can survive on a sparser diet. The evolution of centaurism gave the onychodonts a major advantage, both in giving them a more efficient limb configuration and providing them with powerful weapons to latch onto large or fast-moving prey. Once this innovation occurred, it wasn't long before one branch of onychodonts took over the niches of the dominant predators, evolving into enormous hypercarnivores. But not all onychodonts will be giant. A separate branch may retain the mesocarnivorous lifestyle of their dromaeopod ancestors, going after smaller prey in open habitats. We'll call them allodonts. And perhaps one clade of these allodonts spreads into the far north, possibly driven from the steppe by competition from their larger relatives. As mesocarnivores, their varied diet will be a great asset in the tundra, as they'll be able to subsist on vegetation when prey is scarce. Like all onychodonts, their forelimbs will be their primary means of catching prey and handling food, while their small pedipalps are used for inflicting damage and in processing food before it's swallowed. Due to their small size, they won't be able to store very much body heat, so they'll need to take every possible precaution against the cold, not only evolving shorter limbs and stockier bodies, but uniquely, these animals may further reduce their surface area by internalizing their gonopods within their abdomen, minimizing their exposure to the frigid air. For additional warmth, they can also rely on their endothermy, which, like the leptopods, they may make more efficient by evolving their setae into a dense coat of insulation. Unlike the leptopods, though, who have simple acuminate setae, these allodont setae may evolve a branching or pectinate shape, which will allow them to form a denser covering and to more efficiently trap air. Also unlike the leptopods, whose thermoregulation operates continuously to keep the body at a constant high temperature, the onychodonts have facultative endothermy, meaning they only regulate their body temperature under energetically favourable conditions. Since they're already capable of essentially switching off their metabolism, this may evolve into a form of hibernation. Unlike the aestivation seen in the Zoroastricans, hibernation typically occurs specifically in response to the cold and is exclusive to endotherms, involving the animal actively disabling its thermoregulation. In this state, virtually all metabolic activity grinds to a halt, and the animal can survive solely on fat reserves for weeks or even months. This hibernation and their dense coat of integument will help these allodonts adapt to the harsh winters. But once again, these animals will need to solve the problem of ensuring their offspring don't freeze to death before they hatch. One option is for the mother to incubate the ootheca by warming it with her own body, but if she leaves the ootheca for even a short time, the young will be left extremely vulnerable. Carrying the ootheca with her will slow her down considerably, which isn't a problem for a large placid herbivore like a thylacopod, but for a predator that relies on speed, dragging an egg sac around everywhere she goes will severely impede her hunting. The only practical way to ameliorate this problem is to increase the amount of time the young spend developing inside the mother, and to reduce the amount of development that occurs once the ootheca has been delivered, which may ultimately result in yet another instance of ovoviviparity. Like the lystrachirids in the desert, the scarcity of resources in the tundra makes it difficult to provide a substantial enough yolk to last the young for the whole of their development. But unlike the lystrachirids, these allodonts can't afford to give birth to premature young, as if they're born before they've developed sufficient size and insulation, they'll be at increased risk of dying from the cold. In response to this, instead of relying on lacithotrophy, providing a limited yolk as the young's only source of food, These allodonts may instead evolve a form of matratrophy, growing a placenta-like organ through which additional nutrients can pass from the mother to the embryos throughout their development. It's important to note that while matratrophy is most commonly associated with placental mammals, it's also independently evolved hundreds of times in many unrelated clades, including among reptiles, amphibians, fish, and even invertebrates. Although it imposes a greater burden on the mother by requiring her to impart more resources into her developing offspring, matratrophy is a much more reliable way for the mother to nurture her young than leucisthotrophy, and guarantees that a higher proportion of them will survive until they're ready to leave the mother's protection. Although they're not as big or fearsome as their hypercarnivorous relatives, these tundra-dwelling allodonts will be some of the most exquisitely adapted predators within the Arctic latitudes. We'll call them thecopods. As mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the extreme temperatures, low precipitation, and lack of food will result in very low levels of biodiversity for the deserts and tundra, and so the clades we've discussed here will be some of the only ones that will manage to adapt to the brutal conditions that these new biomes present, which will form over a period of about 30 million years or so as the two halves of the supercontinent begin drifting apart. But in the next episode, we'll look at biomes that face the exact opposite situation, when we return to the tropics to see how the abundance of food, water, and energy cultivates the highest levels of biodiversity anywhere on the planet. Thanks to Campfire for sponsoring this episode. I've told you before about their writing and world-building software Campfire Pro, but as of this month they've launched their brand new software Blaze, a browser-based application that offers all of the features of Campfire Pro, including character sheets, maps, timelines, magic systems, languages, and encyclopedia entries, plus a bevy of new tools like a word processor, a research module, and the ability to share and collaborate with other users in real time. Unlike Campfire Pro though, you only pay for the modules you need, either by one-time purchase or through a monthly or yearly subscription, allowing you to customize your interface to suit your specific writing and world-building needs. And like I said at the beginning of the video, Blaze is an open beta for the whole of October, during which time it's totally free. To try it out for yourself or to learn more, check out the link in the description. And in other big news, for those of you who've been asking for a video game based on this series, you're in luck. There's now a game project in the works. Anyone with expertise in art, audio, planning, story development, or programming is encouraged to join the development team. Links to the Discord server in the description. And once again, a huge thanks to all the fans over on Discord who submitted artwork for this episode, who saved me a tremendous amount of time when making these videos and make them look a hell of a lot better in the process. Links to the main server and the fan art server in the description. And as always, a massive thanks to all the patrons, whose continued support makes videos like this possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.